Good morning, everyone. My name is Cathrine Øverli, and I'm a postdoctoral researcher at the Department of Social Anthropology here at the University of Bergen. And today I'm representing Eimer Bergen, who is organizing this breakfast meeting together with Bergen Global. So warm welcome to everyone who is following us online, and particularly to those of you who took the time to come here today. Maybe some of you don't know what Eimer is, so I'll just start explaining it briefly. Eimer stands for International Migration and Ethnic Relations Research Unit, and it's a network of researchers located at different institutions here in Bergen, working with topics related to migration and ethnic relations. So this will be the first of our monthly seminars this fall. And I wanted to draw your attention to the fact that Eimer is celebrating its 25th anniversary with a big event in November, on November 2nd to 4th. An invitation to that will come out this week, which means by tomorrow. So if you haven't signed up for our newsletter already, you should do so. I think you will now see, yes, our website, uib.no/Eimer. That's a Norwegian website, and you have to click into the English page to see our activities and also sign up for our newsletter. So please do that. But today is not about Eimer. We are so lucky to have 3 speakers with us today. Our main speaker, Zoe Jordan, is a senior lecturer at the Center for Development and Emergency Practice at Oxford Brookes University. And she will be talking about the effects of EU migration policy in Jordan with a focus on education and employment. So Zoe's work is part of a larger project, the Effects Project, which is led by Cathrine Talleraas, who is a postdoctoral researcher here at Christian Michelsen Institute, CMI, and also a senior researcher at the Peace Research Institute in Oslo, PRIO, DO. Yes, and last but not least, we have another expert on the topic and the region, Sarah Tobin, senior researcher at CMI as well, and she will be commenting on Zoe's presentation and leading us into some reflections. So without further ado, I give the word to Cathrine, who will say something about this project. So we go.
Thank you, Cathrine. Very glad to be able to present some findings from the project through the Eimer seminar series. It's very good. So I would like to say a few words about the project. Maybe we could get the PowerPoint on. You can see. So yes, so this is the topic of today's talk that Zoe will go into. And then when talking about the effects of EU migration policies in Jordan, that is part of a broader project, which is focusing on the implications of European and EU policies of different kinds that has to do with migration in the extraterritorial areas, so outside of Europe. So when we talk about externalisation policies, it means basically the policies that EU and European countries put in place to protect their borders or to disable migrants from reaching the European borders outside of EU territory, simply speaking. So this project tries to understand the unintended and potentially also consequential implications of those kind of policies. So we look at 6 different countries in the project. It's quite diverse areas, but including Senegal, Ghana, Libya, Ethiopia, Lebanon and Jordan, to really to try to understand the broad array of different types of consequences across different societal levels and sectors in different areas where there are completely different migration contexts and scenarios and different relations to the European Union. But the key question that we try to grapple with in the project is here, is how do key stakeholders in Africa and the Middle East, then these 6 countries, navigate competing global and national priorities regarding migration management in what we call an EU-centric policy context. This means that we don't necessarily only look at EU initiated policies, but we look also at national policies, regional policies that influence migration governance and management in the countries that we focus on, but see it as they are developed and function in an EU-centered policy context where some of the aims and underlying narratives derive from the European Union. So we look at 3 different levels of the policy cycle here, where we have different sub-questions that I won't go into now, but so we will mention some of them. So you can think of it as the top level of the policy. So we look at national and regional policy priorities on migration. So thinking about how EU ideas about migration and migration policies are institutionalized in these national contexts. And second, we move on to the middle level of the policy, where we think about how these policies are implemented, what are the challenges with these policies, because quite often we know from previous research that policies work on paper, but not so much in practice often. We don't know what the practice of the policies are. So trying to dig into the bureaucracy of the implementation, what is really happening, what kind of actors are involved in different ways, and so on. And then finally, this leads us down to the 3rd level, where we try to look at the local level impact of these very often broad policies. So that could be local level on local populations, but also local bureaucracy, local stakeholders, different areas of policy, and so on. It's a very broad project, very interesting project, I think, and not least important, seeing it's a lot of EU funding that goes and individual European countries funding that it goes into these broad packages of externalization policies. So it's really important to know the consequences that they lead to. So I just wanted to mention a bit about the different, not going into the details of all the researchers involved, but we have quite a good group of excellent researchers that work on mostly and already on these specific areas, but also in the migration context. And then it's steadily growing, the group. It's part of the idea of the project is that we have a core group of researchers coming from Christian Michelsen Institute. So here, the Danish Institute for International Studies in Copenhagen, the University of Manchester, and Oxford Brookes University, here represented by Zoe. And then as we need to engage in collaborations with research institutions elsewhere, we also do so, seeing that we really want to try to have a bottom-up analysis. So this is not something that's easy to do with only researchers from the global north. So that's also a part of the project aim. So also I wanted to mention that please go in, have a look at our webpage, follow us on Twitter. That would be really nice. We're in the middle of the project right now, so it will carry on until the end of 2024. There's a lot of interesting material coming out as we're going into the stage of fieldwork and analysis. And therefore, I'm very happy to have Zoe ready with her preliminary research findings from Jordan, where she is collaborating with also research Cathrine Brun, also coming from Send Up at Oxford Brookes. So thank you, Zoe. And Sarah, we can sit downstairs and wait, perhaps.
Drink your coffee. Ooh. Thank you very much for the welcome, Katrina, and for having me at CMI this week. It's been really nice. It's going very, very quickly. And thank you as well to Cathrine and Ima for hosting me this morning. It's really nice to get this chance to speak to you all. And as Katrina said, we're very much in the middle of things. And it's a really nice opportunity to be able to get some thoughts out of my head and hear what people have to say about them. So thank you for that. Just to quickly say as well as working with Cathrine Brun, I've been working with two great researchers in Jordan who have been doing all kinds of things, interviews and policy reviews and so on. So yeah, it's Rasada and Dana Bedat who have been fantastic so far and will be continuing to work together as well. So today what I wanted to speak a little bit about is the kind of absence of an overarching migration policy in Jordan, which in some ways makes it somehow difficult to start even approaching this question of what are the effects of EU externalization and what we might learn about those externalization processes from looking in particular domains of policy. So I've chosen to look at education and employment, which are two very big areas where the EU and Jordan are collaborating, forming partnerships, and I'll talk about that a little bit more in a few slides. So today I'm really focusing a little bit more on that first area that we mentioned, the kind of what are the national priorities on migration in Jordan and how, when, why are different stakeholders agreeing to these policies. But this is very preliminary thoughts, so we'll see how it goes. Yeah, so I'm going to briefly explain the Jordan context because I'm not sure who in the room already knows too much about it, so I'll try to keep it short, but enough to give you an idea. And some of the key big agreements that exist between Jordan and the EU, and then I'll come a little bit more into the details of what's happening in the education landscape, the employment landscape, some of the differences between them, and think about where relationships might be going next, and some differences we can draw out. I hope most people know where Jordan is, but just in case, it's situated right in the middle. I think the king described it as between Iraq and a hard place several years ago. So it shares borders with Syria, Iraq, Palestine, Israel, and Saudi Arabia. So it is somewhere that receives a lot of refugees. Most recently, it's Syrian refugees that have been attracting the most attention. At the moment, there's a little under 700,000 Syrian refugees registered with the United Nations High Commission for Refugees. The government estimates of the number of Syrians in the country are much higher. They're more at 1.4 million, I think, with some question marks around the actual numbers. But there's also, I think the latest count is 57 other nationalities of refugee in Jordan, and it's quite a considerable amount. We're talking 85,000 people or so it's not nothing. And already that's not even considering Palestinian refugees and those of Palestinian origins, which it very much depends which number you take, but we're talking something in the 2 million, let's say, range. And this is from a country with a population of around about 10 million. So it's a very substantial proportion of that country that either has a significant history of displacement or is still displaced. And while a lot of people will have heard of the camps such as Zatri or Azraq, which are in the north of the country, and at some points have been the biggest refugee camps in the world, most refugees in Jordan aren't living in those camps. They're living in Ibid, in Amman, in Mafraq, or in these towns and cities outside. So one of the things that we've been doing in our research is going to some other places, essentially. So we've been working in Amman, in Ibid, and in Karak, which is maybe a slightly unusual choice, but it's been very interesting. It's a less economically well-off area of the country, so it's quite interesting to see how some of these dynamics are playing out there. Just to say as well, I focus on them much less, partly because the EU focus isn't really on these, but there is a very large labor migrant population in Jordan. So again, the difference between the registered migrants and others is quite significant, but an estimated 1 million or more labor migrants in the country. And Jordan itself has a fairly significant diaspora, around about 10% of its countries, most of those in countries in the Gulf, rather less in the EU. So that's another kind of factor to bear in mind when we're thinking about what's going on in Jordan, and is that we often talk about it as being a place that receives refugees, but actually it's it's going all directions. So we could say people are coming in, people are coming out. And for a long time, Jordan has positioned itself as a country of transit, in that people can come through, they can stay for a little while, but they're going to be moving on again. But certainly in the last years, I think there's a much bigger discourse looking at what EU policies are doing in Jordan, saying that this is actually becoming a place of containment. And as we said, the role of externalisation policies is to control the EU's borders from outside of the EU. And one of the ways they're doing that is essentially keeping people in Jordan. And the reason I chose education and employment is that a lot of the idea being that if you can get people skilled, if you can get them jobs, they're not going to want to travel to Europe. There is a lot of literature that we can dig into to think about how much that's actually happening and how much that works. But I do think there's quite an important shift happening in how Jordan is conceptualized these days, and how much that onwards movement is actually happening, because arguably at the moment returns are next to nothing, and resettlement is globally always next to nothing, even from Jordan, which has fairly good resettlement compared to some other crises. So yeah, we have a population where the vast majority of refugees have been there far more than the 5 years that we'd use to define protracted displacement, most of them more than 10 years at this point, or heading in that direction. Yeah, so in terms of policymaking in Jordan, this is very whistle stop, but it's generally seen to be a very highly centralized political system, and that the decisions kind of come through either the king and then diffuse out through line ministries and municipalities. As I said, there isn't a migration policy. There are various laws that kind of govern the presence of foreigners, but there's not a specific refugee framework, as it were, that's governed through a memorandum of understanding with UNHCR, which kind of details the rights and responsibilities. But yeah, it's not really there. The other big thing that is in place to deal with refugees is what are called the Jordan response plans, which come out every 2 years, I think, if I've got that right. And they kind of set out what are the needs in, at the moment, it's 7 or 9 key domains, so education, shelter, livelihood, so on. What's needed, who's going to respond, what the key aims are, where we're going with it. So they set a direction for the response to refugees, and there is a really strong role of the different line ministries in there. So I've put the Ministry of Education and the Ministry of Labour up here because that's what I'm talking about. If you're looking at health or something, obviously health would become more relevant. There's a question mark after Ministry of Labour, because there was a recent announcement that the Ministry of Labour is going to be shut, and some of its functions will be moving to the Ministry of the Interior, which I'm still learning about this actually, but so that would be to do things to do with work permits for migrants. So we'll be moving into the Ministry of Interior to deal with security. And I think that's a very interesting shift. The Ministry of Interior already hosts the Syrian Refugee Affairs Directorate and things like that. So it is also already quite prominent in a lot of the management of refugees in the country, and even those areas where it's not the direct lead, it is implicated in a lot of the discussions, which we'll come back to later. MOPIC is the Ministry for Planning and International Collaboration, something like that, who are in charge of kind of overseeing the collaboration between the international community and Jordan, and authorizing many of the projects that will be coming through. As a very potted summary of what they do. I'm going to leave it there rather than go on, but that gives you a rough idea of who some of the players on the Jordanian side are. So what I would say as a broad headline is that Jordan and the EU have constructed a partnership that works for them at the kind of top level. Jordan is fairly adept at leveraging its refugee population in order to secure international support and to secure financing, and the EU kind of gets what it wants in that it largely people are staying in Jordan and aren't moving into the EU. That can be dug into much more, but I think as a key takeaway, that's kind of where they're at the moment. I do have a big question mark around how important the EU actually is in some of these discussions. It is a big player. particularly within the refugee field. But I think when you look at what it's doing and its relative role compared to the Gulf states, particularly Saudi Arabia, look at the USA, look at the migration agenda compared to other agendas, particularly around kind of security and stability, I think we have to take how important the EU is with a bit of a pinch of salt, we can say. But nonetheless, it is a big player, and it's one that everyone there is very familiar with. I'm not going to go into these in detail because I could spend, I don't know, about 3 days, I think, talking about each one. But an idea of some of the key agreements, and to let you know what's going on, the Jordan Compact is probably most famous for being the agreement that opens up work permits to Syrian refugees. It's been happening for about 5 years now, so there are now reviews coming out about how successful that has been. Feel free to dive into that. It's very interesting, I think. There's also, it's a point I'll come back to, but there have in the last few years been noise about kind of renegotiating this compact, and that's not happened, which I think is interesting in and of itself, that they've just said, no, we'll leave it how it is. And those have been followed up by Brussels conferences, which kind of renew these agreements and international funding for Jordan over the years. There's an EU mobility partnership with Jordan, which again offers a big framework for a lot of what's going on, and the association agreement, which is in line with that. And the most recent meeting from that was in June. So they've just launched the new partnership priorities from now until 2027, which is always interesting to see what they're talking about, what's being set out. And then in terms of funding, there's several streams coming in. A big one has been the Madad Fund, which is basically the EU trust fund for the region, which operates across 5 countries, with each one having its own chapter, but that has just come to an end. So we're seeing exactly what's going to happen next. And there are the big packages of kind of more macro financial assistance. And there was also quite a considerable amount of COVID assistance coming in from the EU to Jordan. Yeah, and then the EU also contributes to the general refugee fund. And I've also just put Erasmus Plus there because I think it's quite a specific program that's very deliberately about kind of Jordanian mobility at a certain level into the EU. But it's fairly small, actually, to be honest, but it is there. Okay. So coming back to why I wanted to think about education and employment rather than anything else. First of all, to be quite frank, it's because I know more about education and employment than other areas. So I spent the last 2 years working on a project about this, so it's following my own existing knowledge. But it is also clearly a priority area for both sides. So I just pulled out from that partnership and priorities document that's just come out, you know, the very rough and ready version of looking at it, but the most common words used. And we can see that this isn't, you know, it's an economic agreement. Work is there, education is there. These are things that are being discussed and put forward in the language that they're using as their key partnerships. There's a lot of funding available for each of those. So, you know, the Jordan Compact was at 300 million in loans for job creation and education. I was just looking yesterday at some of the more recent funding that's coming out, or the last round that came out through Madad rather. And again, you're seeing education, and there it's more livelihoods framing, but still they are the big areas that are receiving huge amounts of money compared to other ones. And then maybe taking a step back, a little bit more theoretical slightly, as I was saying, this idea that education and employment are drivers of resilience, and being resilient is what is going to keep people in Jordan, means that they are a focus for the EU side as well. So what we've actually seen from all of those different documents, all of this different funding, a lot of talking that's happening together is, just thinking how to phrase it, there is a lot that is happening on the ground, but there is also a lot that's happening that's talking. So legislation and regulations are slowly coming in or are being negotiated, but they're not necessarily consistently implemented. And even if you go back to the Jordan Compact, for example, which is the biggest one, you can see there are plenty of ways that that is not being implemented, perhaps as you would, if you looked at it on paper, it's not actually happening in the way you might expect. So, you know, issues around fees for work permits, who is actually taking up those jobs. There's still a very low participation among women, for example. So it's it is happening, but maybe not exactly how it's meant to be. There's a lot of kind of rule by instruction or regulation rather than it being an actual legislative change, which maintains flexibility in the response. And I think that's quite an important part of that dynamic that leaves it open, we can say. Yeah, as I said, there is success on both the education side and the employment side. I think the education enrollment rate at primary level is up at 92 or 93%, so it's quite substantial. But what happens after that is questionable. And the implementation of these policies is still nationality dependent in Jordan, certainly. And then I think a very common feedback that we had in some of our interviews is that at all levels, whether that's from kind of top policymakers through to people, people living in Jordan, they're very well aware of what the aims of these policies are. Whether they agree with them or not is entirely different, and they're very capable of taking those policy aims and making it work for them in whatever way of subverting that might be. And we're still digging into this, but some of the key influences that are actually coming out about when are these policies agreed to, finance is a big one, right? Whether that's the kind of availability of resources to actually implement the policy, but also one of Jordan's priorities is very much to do with attracting investments and encouraging long-term growth in the country. And that is, I think, guiding a lot of what they're looking at. But again, coming back to the Jordan Compact, I think that was a motivating, very strong factor between agreeing that. So the work permits, the flip side of that is that it comes along with preferential trade access to the EU, support for investment, and so on. So that's still very clearly up there, and I would put another very big question mark about how successful that's actually been in really securing the investment that Jordan was looking for, but it's still there. And going back to the policy priorities document, there's a lot of language all the way through about the green digital transformation or transition that's happening. So they're very much still pushing this. Aside from that, I think regional political and economic allegiances are still making a difference in kind of the different permissions that different groups have in the country with an access to various different rights, whether that's investment or ownership of certain things. Resources and capacity, there's a huge tranche of the EU funding that's to do with capacity building and what that looks like. Capacity for what purposes, with the goals set by who is always a question. Political will, of course, and the domestic concerns and tensions, particularly the notion of security, I think, which is very widely interpreted in that, this is about instability or change, as well as what you might think of as a more traditional security threat. The comparative power of different institutional actors. So coming back, for example, I was mentioning the Ministry of the Interior as a very key actor that does have the power to kind of influence what's happening in different sectors. And I put a question mark next to the role of key individuals, kind of key movers within the policy zone who have that capacity to translate key ideas across. It's something I'm still figuring out exactly who they are, if they're there, and what they're doing. And then just thinking a little bit about the perspective of potential migrants. So this might be those who have already moved into Jordan, but these were focus groups conducted between Syrians and Jordanians together. So it's also Jordanians who would be looking to go abroad and asking them, so how do you see the EU? What do you know about the EU? And they were very clear that the EU has a foreign agenda. The groups differ on what exactly they think that agenda is. But yeah, they're very aware that it's part of what the EU is doing is trying to prevent their movement. But there was also, in every single group, there was a question about what I thought about whether the EU was a genuine humanitarian actor or whether they were there in the interests, self-interest. And you can see this is a picture of some of the discussion that some of the issues they were having in Jordan are to do with unemployment and the cost of life and so on. And so those are drivers that were making them look to move, but they were also the restrictions on them being able to move. I've also very briefly, at the time I was there, it was Jordanian Independence Day, and there was a series of success stories that were released. And one of them that was receiving quite a lot of interest at the time was a young man who was a success because he had traveled to America and started a successful business. So there's a lot of kind of, if you want to be successful, you have to migrate discourse going around at that time amongst the communities we were working with. So just coming back a bit more concretely to the education and employment with my last few slides. So if we look at what's going on with relation to education agreements, I think these are, I'm not going to say easy, but perhaps easier than the employment agreements that we're seeing between the EU and Jordan. And partly this might be to do that it's got a stronger humanitarian framing, so it's more short-term, which is less politically problematic, right? Especially at the moment, how humanitarianism works in education. It's kind of short-term, apolitical. Let's get the kids educated, at least through primary school. It's slightly less contentious, perhaps. I think generally it's focused on children. There's also, I think it's easier to, build consensus around that in the domestic kind of population as well. Generally, both sides, I see a high value, particularly in primary education. We can raise more questions about what happens at secondary and university, but people are generally agreed, okay, let's at least do primary education. To balance that out, I would say there are issues around stretching the local system. You have double shift schools where Syrians are coming to school in the afternoon, for example. There are problems to do with overcrowding. But generally, I'd say that these agreements between the EU and Jordan relating to education have been more straightforward. I think there's international, bilateral, and individual frameworks that allow them to be positioned as kind of wins. So whether that's sustainable development goals, such as Global Compact on Refugees, or national education strategies, it all flows a bit better. It works for Jordan. They have a more educated workforce. As I said, they're looking to shift into a more digital kind of entrepreneur economy, so that's working for them. And if people do succeed in education and can manage to go abroad and become part of their diaspora, there is quite a large flow of remittances, so that's kind of all good on that side, essentially. And same for the EU. They see it as a tool of migration policy, and it does fit in with their kind of global goals around education as well. So I'm not saying it's not at all difficult, but I think it is that there's a fairly large degree of alignment between these two policies, these two actors in this area. Though I do think something that's going to become more problematic is there is a high rate of unemployment in Jordan. It's up at 23 or 24%, and education doesn't necessarily lead to employment. So a project I've been working on recently found the inverse, actually, that as you get more educated, it's actually more difficult to get education, particularly at the level you're educated to. So there is a growing resentment. So where this is going to go, I don't know. But for now, I think we can see that it's worked quite well so far. A bit in comparison, I think employment agreements have been a lot more contentious. So I think people see it as there being a higher potential for destabilization. It's perhaps seen to be a longer term change that's happening when you allow people to engage in the workforce. That suggests a little bit more that you're moving away from a humanitarian framing, which, as I said, we're talking 10, 11 years at least of Syrian displacement, more for others. It is longer term, but that's still an uncomfortable statement, perhaps, for some. With regards to anyone who's not Syrian, there's very much just an absence, like a policy of non-policy when it comes to working. A great many people are working informally with all of the instability and potential for exploitation and danger that that brings. As I said before, some of the argument for Jordan opening up employment has been to then increase their own trade and investment positions. But I don't think that that has actually really happened as much as they wanted through the Jordan Compact. So yeah, all in all, I think this is a bit more of a contentious place. And in the project, it's a bit more messy for us to get into and to understand what's going on there. So yeah, as I said, I think we're in a position where in recent years, there's been a few different things that have come up for debate or actually haven't, which is perhaps more interesting that they were potentially on the table and haven't been taken forwards. and I don't have a clear answer to this one, but yeah, when there's little appetite for renegotiating those agreements, there's a declining international funding in Jordan at the moment. It was happening anyway, as tends to happen in these kind of crises, but it's been exacerbated perhaps by Ukraine. There is potentially some rapprochement with Syria going on, which changes some of those dynamics perhaps as well. And I think thinking of timeframes here, it's very clearly becoming, if not long term, it's midterm for sure, right? But how that's being approached is different. And I don't think that's necessarily just on the Jordan side as well. I think we can raise some questions about how the EU responds to what it perceives to be as migration threats and how long term it thinks about that, or whether it just reacts to, you know, particularly in 2015, right? It was a very quick reaction about how do we deal with this. So I think we need to change perhaps how that's sometimes conceived. But that said, the EU and Jordan do continue to share priorities. They do share a kind of securitization framework and how they think about migration. And I think there are issues on the horizon, we could say, where they can continue to collaborate, even if that's no longer framed so much around refugees, if it becomes about stability or climate. I think a lot of what's been going on can still be rolled over, essentially, into these new domains. And I think that'll be quite interesting to see how some of that is used in the future, even if the kind of object of the policy changes, how the partnerships continue. Yeah, so final thoughts is that this is a centralized system, but it's not at all a uniform process. That's what's happening in the different sectors suggests that, yeah, we need to think of Jordan not as just as a unified state actor, but really to understand different elements and different time periods. Yeah, the different domains, I would say, are not super coherent necessarily, actually, and definitely not within, like, across domains. And yeah, what's happening next? And as I said, I only very briefly mentioned people today, you know, the potential migrants. And while we might think that the partnership is working for the EU and the Jordanian state, the question of the impact on them is, I think most people are experiencing it as largely negative at the moment, I would say, because people aren't necessarily achieving their aspirations in education or the employment that they want. And so what that is doing to the population who are dreaming of leaving and then not being able to is a very big and serious question mark. But I'm going to leave it there. And I think, Sarah, you next. Yeah. Thanks.
My comments from up here. All right. Okay. Fantastic. Good morning, everyone. Hello, everyone at home or in your home office. Big thank yous first to Zoe for the wonderful talk. This was really invigorating and enlightening, and I always love talking about Jordan. So I am very excited to be here today. Thank you to Cathrine for the invitation today, for the organization, the Effects Project as well. Thank you to IMER, which continues to be a great source of networking and knowledge in the community. And thank you all for coming both home and here. So I want to focus on digging a little bit deeper into some of the things that you have talked about. In particular, I want to start with the idea of, you know, raising this question: what are the national implications of no refugee policy? Because there are a lot. And I think in even considering the prompt from your talk and the relationship of it to the Effects Project, this discussion about sort of national implications is one that could be expanded. So you indicated rightly that there's no sort of set national policy for refugees. There's a historical precedent, of course, for this, given the Palestinian migration into Jordan, as well as other nationalities that are longstanding in the country. But there's also been this voluminous influx of refugees from other Middle Eastern states. In addition to Syria, there is also Yemeni, Somalis, Sudanese, many more. I mean, migrant laborers as well constitute a large portion of the population. So we're talking about actually a surprisingly diverse country when it comes to refugees and migrant workers throughout the country. And it's a small country, right? And by some estimates, the population of 9 million people, just the whole population of the country, is more than 50% non-Jordanian. So this is also a demographic that we see throughout other Middle Eastern countries. The Gulf, of course, is notorious for this kind of thing. But in the case of Jordan, it's not as much labor migration as much as it is refugee influx. So the dynamics and the demographics, I think, are really important to understand in this part of the discussion. Because then when you have no refugee policy, what actually emerges is refugee policies based on nationality. A kind of segmentation, a separation of policy according to whether you come from Syria, or you come from Iraq, or you come from Sudan, or you come from fill in the blank country. At the same time, the UN is pushing what they're calling the one refugee policy. The idea that every refugee should be treated the same in the sense that they should all be able to receive equal forms of protection and support, that all refugees have vulnerability that needs to be addressed in a just and fair, equitable kind of way. So there's a kind of paradox happening in Jordan. On the one hand, you have policies and practices that are developing that segment and give preference, in fact, to some kinds of refugees over others, at the same time that international bodies are pushing for similarity and equity. So a hypothetical case, which is probably not actually that hypothetical, might be something like 2 men named Muhammad live in Amman. One is Syrian and one is Yemeni, or Sudanese perhaps. 35 years old, married, 3 kids. They both came as refugees in, say, 2015, 16. What they have access to, what their family life is like, what their employment life is like, are dramatically different. Muhammad the Syrian is able to get a work permit. He is able to get access to, hopefully, dignified labor as a result. His wife is able to get a work permit to search for labor for a job. Their kids are able to access the Jordanian school system in this shared shift practice. So they go to school in the afternoons, in the second shift, and they are living in poverty, but they're safe. They're not at risk of being deported or returned to Syria. They have proper documentation. They have mobility. Their work permits give them access to all parts of the country so they can visit friends and family. They can attend weddings, funerals, and attend to their family networks and support systems throughout the country. So at the same time, this other Muhammad, who's 35, married, 3 kids, mid-30s as well, he does not have access to a work permit, so he's working informally. His wife also does not have access to a work permit, so she's maybe working informally. The children do not have access to schools. They have to go school to school and negotiate one-on-one with each of the principals of those primary schools in an attempt to try to get their kids access to education. This family is living much more precariously than the Syrian family. They are perhaps registered with the UN, but perhaps not. It depends on their nationality, where they've come from. They are at risk of deportation. They're at risk of social ostracization in their communities, depending on where they live. Their access to aid is determined by whatever church or Islamic aid agency is able to support them in their place. Their situation is far more precarious than the Syrian. So we have, in the case of Jordan, the idea that no refugee policy actually results in multiple refugee policies that occur simultaneously and in tension and in conflict with each other. The Palestinians, of course, occupy a voluminous literature and topic of discussion, but let's not understate that the history of Palestinian migration and residency, and even the extension of citizenship to Palestinians, to some Palestinians, has altered the landscape for refugees in Jordan for the time to come. I wouldn't say forever, who knows what will happen. But I do think that it's important to recognize that these are historically rooted policies. The Jordanians have done a series of trial and error and attempt and change to go with the global political flows and to go with the national policies and protections of national interests that they have extended. So all of these multiplicity of policies operate at the same time, and it results in vast differences in education and employment, as I mentioned in these kind of hypothetical cases. But what this means for externalization policies is that it weakens the attempt of the government and of the EU bodies to implement externalization effectively. Because what it essentially says is it might work for some people, probably not all, and it's going to happen in these different ways. And so what are we going to do? I mean, if you're not supporting all of the refugees, the kind of push-pull theoretical framework falls apart. In the case of education and employment, I think there are a couple of really important aspects of externalization policy in these fields that should be highlighted. So the first is I totally agree with Zoe that education, especially primary education, is low-hanging fruit. It is easy access. It's morally laudable. It ends up being, I mean, there's already a building in place. In terms of infrastructure, it's easy to implement. And in fact, you're able to employ more Jordanian teachers as a result, right? So it has a kind of win-win ethos that many people have lauded. In fact, in a discussion with the Norwegian embassy in Jordan, they've mentioned that that's an area that they have focused on in particular with their efforts in the country. But again, education is largely ignoring non-Syrian refugee children. Palestinians fall under UNRWA, so it's a separate educational system. But the Sudanese, the Iraqi, Yemeni children do not have the same level of access to education. So you could say, okay, maybe this externalization policy is really designed for Syrians, right? Given what the so-called EU refugee crisis, we want to keep the Syrians out of the EU. So this is the plan. This is the attempt, right? But the great irony, as Zoe rightly pointed out, is that education gives mobility. This lauding of the idea that this guy went to America, and I mean, this becomes possible because of education. So in an attempt to keep people there now, namely Syrians in Jordan now, what they're doing is potentially laying a landscape in the future for more mobility and even into the EU, to the West, to America. So I think the idea of using education is as an externalization policy, potentially quite effective in the short term, but has long-term implications that really, I think, perhaps even undermine EU attempts and other government attempts to keep people in place. As for employment, it is a much more controversial and charged issue. I remember I was meeting with a very high-ranking official in Jordan, one of these high-ranking individuals that have a lot of influence, and I asked if they could go back and do the Jordan Compact again, what they would do differently. And the person responded that actually they would have preferred to have negotiated for more businessmen to come in from Syria, more educated persons to come in, that they would have opened up access to professionals, teachers, doctors, lawyers, all of the higher socioeconomic status professions, because that would have actually promoted the national development efforts of the Jordanians much better. And they did not. And they've made it very difficult for foreign-trained Syrians, for example, amongst others, of course. Iraqis certainly fall into this kind of position, having well-regarded educational backgrounds. They're unable to get employment in their fields, even today, in many of these fields. And thus, the professional population, working population, and the development of Jordan, this person had said had suffered. And so the idea now is that there's a larger Syrian population, for example, in Jordan, who's suffering high rates of employment, very high. But it falls in this context of Jordan where unemployment is already quite high. The number I've frequently used is 30%. So the unemployment rate is so high, especially for college graduates. You know, they come out of school and best case scenario, they work at KFC or McDonald's because the kind of professional positions and professional development are still happening. So in general in Jordan, it is the case that the labor market is largely informal, even amongst Jordanians. And in conversations I've had with ILO and with the UN, I mean, this is really the biggest challenge to overcome, which is that how do you incorporate people into the formal labor market when the pre-existing conditions are already so dominantly informal? In fact, there seems to be relatively little competition between Jordanians and Syrians for jobs, for example. And there's a number of reasons for that. But it's this larger context of formalizing labor in general that has been the challenge, which is not specific, of course, to refugees, Syrian or otherwise. But in fact, and this is my sort of concluding point, that from an externalization perspective, if the EU and other governments are keen to try to impact effective externalization policies, regularizing the labor market and including all refugees into the labor market would actually be a better way to go than this sort of segmented policy that keeps so many people out. But to do that, it's such a heavy lift given the Jordanian context of informal labor and high unemployment. So those are my comments. I would like to ask, as just I guess a couple of topics for discussion. Yeah, one. So, or did you want to come up and, I guess, sorry, I'm not sure. Perfect, okay.
I
Great.
can
Thank you.
want to say thank you here to you, Sarah. Very thoughtful comments, I think. A lot of discussion in the seminar and definitely afterwards. But let's give Sarah applause first. I think it was brilliant. And then I just wanted to say to the audience online and here in the room that if you have any questions or comments, please prepare them. And then we'll listen to Sarah's questions if you have some for Zoe. And then we'll give Zoe an opportunity to respond. And then we'll dig in the questions from the others too. Right.
Yeah. I'll come around this way. Yeah. So I think, well, do you want to just respond first, and then I have a couple of follow-up
Sure. I will try and organize my thoughts into something that makes sense. One, on the question of the one refugee policy and the wide range of nationalities in Jordan who are excluded, which I love that you picked this up. It's very much up my street. And it's something that I've been thinking about for a while, just even if we go back to this argument that what Jordan is doing is saying, hey, can we have some support, please? Because we've got all of these refugees. It doesn't fully make sense to exclude them, right? Because you've got 10 plus 15% of your refugee population that you're not leveraging, essentially, even if we're going to put it in these quite crude terms, right? That they could be attracting much more support and it's not being used. So I think it's really interesting to think about why is that not being picked up? And also even there's a shift, right, that's happened in the last 5 years to actually recognizing from all sides that this isn't just about Syrian refugees, that, the growth in attention, particularly to Sudanese refugees, increasingly towards Yemeni refugees, has really happened very recently, from whichever side we're looking at it. And I think there's much more openness from everyone now, whether that's from donors to fund those projects or from actors within Jordan to acknowledge that there are these groups present and they should be included in the policy. I think we're seeing positive changes, but it's very new and it's very slow. Yeah, and I think also on the opening up of access to work to everyone, it would be great. But I think at the moment we're still at the stage where the impacts of the Jordan Compact have actually been to perhaps marginalize those who previously were managing to work. And what came along with the Jordan Compact was kind of the additional closure of additional sectors of the labor market. So just to briefly explain, some job positions are only open to Jordanian nationals, and you can't access those if that's not who you are. And whereas previously it was, I can't remember the exact numbers, I don't know if you have them to your mind, but it was a smaller list and it's been added to, so it's much bigger. And what's happening is that people who were previously kind of able to somehow find a job in these areas are being pushed out of those areas. So although I'd very much like it to be open to everyone, I feel the direction we're actually going in is perhaps informalizing even more people to a certain extent. Very interesting to see how that goes. And there is, of course, in some of the discussions we've been having as well, people being very explicit about if you formalize things, then you can know more things. And that can also be very useful, right? So we'll see what happens. And then I think just very briefly on the question, like we were both saying about education as low-hanging fruit, which I think it very much is, but only in how humanitarian education currently works, right? And I'm thinking about So work with Katrina Bruin and Maha Schwabe, and even going back to Dryden Peterson, kind of what are we doing with refugee education essentially, and does, if you as you rightly said, this link between increasing education, increasing mobility, is there something behind the huge amount of resources that have gone into education that relies on assumption that Syrians will be returning? So, is this a short-term policy essentially that is reaching its end, or is it going to continue, or is there going to be a major shift in the employment market that's going to make that not happen essentially? Because that's one of the things that could interrupt that education mobility pathway, is if people can access decent, fulfilling work where they are. So yeah, I do really think that education has worked for the last years, but might be about to go through a big shift. I don't know, but it doesn't make sense exactly how it is, and I think there's growing resentment among the population. And sorry, one final thing was also about the diversity of the refugee population, and in some of the focus groups we're doing, which, as I said, were between Syrians and Jordanians, and asking them, what's going on here? What challenges are people facing? And I actually found it very interesting that they brought up Yemeni refugees as a group that they wanted to talk about who was facing challenges. But I find it particularly interesting they brought up Yemeni, not any of the other nationalities of refugee in the country. And this would require a lot more thought to really get into this. But I think there's some very interesting questions there about kind of social, political, and racial kind of dynamics happening within the population, and who is seen as a refugee, who is seen as a migrant, how it works. I'm going to stop and let us discuss.
Thank you, Zoe. So I think, Sarah, if you want, you can shoot us another question, and then I'll see if there are any hands and add it to that. At least I see one. So yeah, you go ahead, Sarah.
I'll ask a quick question because I'm also interested in the discussion with the audience. So the linking of in your response of potential return to Syria and education is very interesting.
Yeah, it only came to me as you spoke, so don't hold it to me 100%.
No, but this is something that I've also heard Jordanians talk about, officials talk about, and Syrians as well. And the challenge from the Syrians' perspective is that what the children are educated into is the Jordanian curriculum. So as a tool for educating on Syria and trying to do, sort of soft policy, right, towards pushing return, it's going to be largely ineffective because the children are being born and raised in Jordan and socialized into Jordanian knowledge and history and taught, Jordanian in the Jordanian educational system. And there was in the early days, especially in the refugee camps, a push to enable Syrian school teachers to teach Syrian kids the Syrian curriculum, especially when the hope for return was quite high. And the Jordanians did not allow for this and instead pushed that the Jordanian curriculum be the one that is taught. So I wonder if you can just respond quickly about what you see about prospects for a return or push for return, and the role of education and employment, in fact, as part of that process.
I can try. I think generally the prospects for return right now are still pretty slim, right? And that goes for most all of the countries that we're talking about where refugees are coming from, but I'll stick to talking about Syria, but I think that's going for everyone. I think they're quite slim, and I think Jordan isn't really trying to push people to return. I think we have to take them fairly genuinely in that they are providing a place of safety for people, and that's going to continue. When it comes back to education, I was more thinking that from the EU perspective, even, right? There must have been something thinking, well, it's okay, we'll just educate people for a few years because they'll be going back. We don't need to worry about what happens. Let's say they arrived when they were 6 or 7, they joined primary school, they're now going through secondary school. That's fine. By the time it becomes an issue, they're gone. And I don't know that for sure. I'm just hypothesizing that might have been what was happening. And I think the same for employment, right? For a long time, you can say, well, using this resilience framework, which again, big questions about this, right? And whether that's what we want to be using. but it works in the short term, right? You can do some cash to work, you can do some livelihoods work, you can keep yourselves going for a little bit, but what next is the big question. And I think, you know, there are definite changes in the landscape in Jordan. You know, the shift from humanitarianism towards development is very much being talked about and implemented in some ways. I think it's still a bit messy. But yeah, I do feel like a shift is happening, but needs to happen more.
I just realized we're a bit short on time.
Ah.
Time flies when having fun. So I think, do we have time for any comments from the audience, or? Yes? Yeah? Yeah, I think, but I think it was yours. Oh no, maybe there. Oh, okay, no, there are a few. I'll start in the back then. So you on the third. Yeah, that's you. And please, we have to be a bit short
like
with
this?
the time.
Yes. Okay. Sorry, I've never had. Thank you so much. Yeah, my name is Gabriela, and I just wanted to ask. I was really interested by this, the discourse of migration for success, and how it seems to circulate. I would say not just in Jordan, probably, but in different contexts. So I wanted to ask, like, how do you make sense of this discourse in Jordan, and how it connects to other migration from other parts of the world, like, you know, even in Spain, where I was from, that idea is starting to also really take off. You have to migrate to specific countries in the global north to be seen as successful. And also, I've read some literature on Iran, and that's also a really prevalent discourse, even for people that are settled, middle class, and so on. There's you have to migrate to the global north, do something there to be seen as successful. If you return or not, that's something different. So I just wanted to kind of see your perspective on how you connect this discourse from the different contexts that you've seen. Yeah.
Thank you. So I think I'll let you respond to that, and also perhaps to add to, I think, because I also found it very interesting, especially seeing the high irony of the Jordanian authorities supporting that kind of discourse, which doesn't really fit with the agenda that they're agreeing upon together with the EU, for instance, and other actors.
Yeah.
So yeah, a short reflection and then.
I try to be quick. First of all, I'm not sure that the Jordanian government was trying to push that discourse when they presented this story. I think this is more a reaction that, you know, friends were coming with their interpretation that maybe this was a mischosen story and having a bit of fun with it. But generally, I think you're right. I mean, globally, I think it'd be the same for you in Ghana as well, and in Lebanon. This idea that you need to move to be successful is definitely not just in the Jordan context, right? I would perhaps come back on the idea that it needs to be to the global north, because if we look at where people are moving actually in Jordan, I'm not entirely negating that there is a big interest in moving to Europe, but perhaps not as big as interest as Europe thinks there is. So if you look at patterns of movement, as I said, they're to the Gulf, you know, which particularly in that region, it makes a lot of sense, right? You can work, you can speak the language, it's more familiar. When we were talking about some of the blocks of thinking about migration to the EU, these are questions that come up, that why people wouldn't want to go. And I think it was very interesting, and we were talking about this briefly yesterday, that this isn't a permanent movement either. People want to move for maybe 10 years, finish their education, have a good job, do well, and come back. So then there is this question about how far are you moving, where are you moving to? But yeah, it is a very common discourse, and I think it's something like 60% of the population that's kind of university age, university educated, wants to engage in some form of mobility. So it's definitely very high.
Thank you. I also want to say thank you to the audience, and sorry we went a bit over time, but I see that there's quite some interest here, so definitely we'll have some more time for these kind of discussions in the future. And again, thank you very much, Sarah, for agreeing to comment on Zoe's presentation, and for Zoe for being here and giving us some thoughts. Do you want to?
Yeah, just wanted to say thank you, Eimer. Very interesting conversation. I've gone on an hour more, I think, about this topic.
Yeah.
So thank you for everyone. for coming.